this wild place doing incredible things. You connected to Emory and the new Civil Rights Archive there? Nope. Well, check it out. Check it out. John McMillian studies 20th century social movements, especially interested in New Left and youth culture, radicalism during the 60s. He is the author of Smoking Typewriters. Isn't that cool? The Sixties Underground Press and the Rise of Alternative Media in America. He is founding co-editor of, I think, one of the very best journals that's out there, The Sixties, a journal of history, politics, and culture. And you really should look at The Sixties. It's online. They do great, great work. I'm going to ask you if your pal is back from London. Michael?
No, he's not back.
Not back. Well, that's really bad. We want him back. The 60s online, it's also published by Routledge since 2008. John has co-edited several scholarly anthologies, contributed short essays and book reviews to the Washington Post, The Nation, The Chronicle of Higher Education, New York Observer, Boston Globe, and The Believer. What's The Believer? John earned his Ph.D. from Columbia in 2006. His dissertation was honored by the American Journalism Historians Association. His M.A. is from Michigan State University, 1996, and a B.A. from Michigan State's James Madison College. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi. It's super great to be here, so thank you very much. Thank you to Robbie for organizing this great panel. I'm honored to be a part of it. I just want to take a minute to say a bit about the important role that Jesse Lemisch played in my life. We met when I was first starting my graduate student experience at Columbia in sort of the mid to late 1990s. And I was really excited to start at Columbia, but then after I arrived, I was a little underwhelmed by the whole experience. I went on to have a very good time there, and it's a great blessing in my life. I had good relationships with my professors. But at first I felt a little bit lost. One of the first courses I took there was a research seminar on 20th century American history. And the goal of that class was to write an essay that would be publishable. And so this was my first time really delving into a lot of primary sources. And I was writing on the New Left. And you know, one of the things that struck me when I was going through this literature was that there was this consensus that the New Left was a highly anti-intellectual movement. And this is something you heard from people on both the left and the right. Paul Berman expressed this very well. He said, quote, "One must remember that the atmosphere of the New Left during the bad old days was not very congenial to intellectual work. Abolish brains was practically a slogan, though no one quite put it that way. Even left-wing brains came under suspicion." And at that same time, I was becoming aware of the work that was being done by some New Left scholars like Stoughton and Jesse. And so I set out to not overturn, but to complicate this idea that the New Left was so anti-intellectual by looking at the work that they did. And I was interested in in what they produced. And I was looking at their scholarship, but also at how they fashioned themselves as scholars. What was their sense of mission within the academy. And I was astonished and pleased to find out that Jesse lived just down the street from me. I didn't know that at first. And so he was about a 10-minute walk. And during my first couple of years at Columbia, we would meet pretty regularly. And we would talk about things. He would help me to refine my ideas. He read drafts of my work. He put me in touch with people that could be helpful. He said nice things about me. And he gave me a lot of confidence. And so he served as kind of an unofficial advisor. And I will always appreciate that. So thank you very much. So this is, preparing for this panel, I reread On Active Service. This is the second time I read it very carefully. I agree with everyone here that this is really, truly a classic in American historiography. The main argument here that during the Cold War era, there were scholars who professed to be neutral and objective, even as they put across, very highly ideological worldviews that were hostile to radicalism. To me, this is irrefutable. And this essay is very carefully argued. It's meticulously documented, and it's also extraordinarily well written. I don't know if we've talked about this, but Jesse has a great prose style for this. I would hate to be on the other end of one of his polemics, let's put it that way. Although if I keep supporting Obama, maybe one of these days, I will be. what I thought I would do is speculate. I wanted to take Jesse's sort of framework and the template that he established and apply it to my own field, which is I study the New Left and youth culture in the 1960s, and I was thinking, you know, what would happen if I took some of Jesse's ideas and you know, saw how transferable they were to my field. And a few things have already come up in this discussion. We've talked about how radical historians in the 60s were in fact persecuted. They were fired, like Stoughton and Jesse, or they were blacklisted. And then Jesse makes the important point, and Rusty, you just mentioned, you know, many more people presumably were simply just not hired. You know, people who were qualified, who would have, you know, served important roles in their programs were not given consideration as a result of their scholarship. I was wondering if that was the case today. Frankly, I'm not sure that we can say it. I mean, it seems likely that some of that may still go on, but everyone here is aware of the corporatization of higher education. Right now, about 25% of faculty members are tenured or on the tenure track. The other 75% are contingent laborers. They're lecturers or adjuncts. And I just think the hiring process is so, you know, it's become capricious and arbitrary. It's hard to say who gets a job and who doesn't and why. I do know some left-wing scholars with impeccable credentials who I think should have jobs, but I know other people who should have jobs. You know, frankly, I would like a job in New York City. So, Ellen, if you ever have any lines open up for a post-war American historian, keep me in mind. You know, another theme that I thought I discerned in this book, I wondered if there was a generational conflict going on. And Jesse said, you know, that's not really what he was trying to imply. But the fact is, you know, in 1969, when this essay was, when he read this essay, he was attacking mostly senior scholars in the profession, and he drew support, I think, mostly from younger scholars. And you know, this was interesting to me because, you know, in my field, the academic study of the 60s, this was an issue of concern for a lot of people. There was some, you know, not too long ago, people were talking about whether or not, you know, the senior scholars in this field are, you know, these are the people who write about the 60s were also people who lived through the 60s, and they make hiring decisions, they award prizes, they referee journal articles, and David Farber, who is a real pioneer in my field, in 2000 wrote an essay in the Chronicle of Higher Education alleging that, he said, quote, "Too many professional gatekeepers have resisted letting young scholars challenge their memories, criticize their generation, or simply explain their experience in unfamiliar contexts." And I'm really not sure how much this is the case today. I mean, some of the so-called sort of younger scholars in my field by this point have been around long enough that they're starting to exert an influence in the field, and that's nice to see. But I can say that there are cases where people have suggested that they occupied a kind of privileged vantage as a result of their personal experience. I just want to read an actual email that I received. About a month ago, I was on C-SPAN. I was promoting my book, Smoking Typewriters, and I got this delightful email. It said, a guy named Gerald Jackman from Santa Barbara. Dear John, I hold a Ph.D. in history received probably before you were born. I lived the 60s, and my impression from watching you on C-SPAN is that you don't know shit about the 60s. You go to City Lights, and they throw nothing but softballs, yada, yada, yada. Your appearance at City Lights seemed very much like a circle jerk. So it's not unheard of for scholars to take that viewpoint. You know, but most importantly, I wanted to look at the my notes are out of order here. Excuse me. You know, some of the scholarship that's been done in my field. When you look at the study of the New Left over the last 20 years, I do think you see a bit of an anti-radical bias. I would say that Todd Gitlin and James Miller are both the scholars whose works are on graduate student reading lists. They were, you know, 20 years ago their works on the New Left came out, but they still are widely read. I think they have a lot to recommend them. These are good books in many respects, but there's something really ironic to me about the fact that the 60s is associated with this populist ethos that we can, you know, better understand history in many cases by looking at it from the bottom up, in Jesse's phrase, and yet many chroniclers of the New Left have been disappointingly top down in their approach, and there's been a tendency among some of these scholars to dwell far too much, I think, on the institutional history of SDS, on the movement as it occurred in large cities, and on the powerful personalities of key movement leaders And SDS, of course, was important, but the New Left was a very broad-based movement. And so in my book, in Smoking Typewriters, I tried to correct for some of these distortions by studying the New Left through the prism of the underground press. And these underground newspapers are interesting because they existed in every pocket of the country, not just in large cities. And it was the nature of these papers that they were highly accessible. They were very democratic. Anyone who wanted to contribute could lay a claim on the attention of the movement in their community by writing for an underground newspaper. So I thought my approach had certain advantages in that this top-down, institutional approach that we see in my field, I think it leaves too much out. And someone else said that, quote, there were many centers of action in the movement, many actions, many interpretations, many visions, and many experiences. And I think that a younger generation of scholars is beginning to honor that. There's a real movement towards social history in my subfield. It's also the case that the writing on the New Left perhaps pays too much favorable attention to the early New Left. The narrative that we're familiar with holds that the New Left began more or less in 1962 with the Port Huron Statement, and that movement's architects were very bright young people who gleaned their ideas about participatory democracy from their encounters with social theorists like C. Wright Mills and the Civil Rights Movement. And as some scholars, besides myself, have pointed out, this early phase is sometimes romanticized as sort of the good 60s. But in fact, that wasn't when a lot was accomplished in the movement. It wasn't until later on, when the New Left was a broad-based mass movement, that it had its greatest effect. And then meanwhile, these same scholars may dwell over much, I think, on the so-called bad 60s. That's the period when activists were flirting with outlandish revolutionary rhetoric, and they were retreating into hedonism and drug abuse and subjecting their opponents to scurrilous and dehumanizing rhetoric, and at the extreme engaging in political violence that was maybe unwise and immoral in some cases. That narrative is pretty firmly implanted in my field, and that suggests that the movement was over by about 1969 or 1970. I don't think that's the case. And I think this framework may betray a certain amount of anti-radical bias. I see some merit in it. I see what they're driving at. But in this framework, the people who are most critical of the U.S. and its role in the world, the people who were most critical of capitalism and its logic, are seen as sort of black sheep. And then finally, concomitant to this, we've seen an outpouring, I think, of very good writing on the New Left recently. But we've seen very little work that's been done on the counterculture that I think is worth very much. When I teach my classes on the 60s, I'm always forced to use memoirs in order to talk about the counterculture, and I wonder if this can be accounted for in part by a certain timidity among scholars in my field, or a failure of imagination. The one very good book on the counterculture that I like is by a professor at Amherst named Nick Bromell. It's called Tomorrow Never Knows. And he set out to understand drug consciousness in the 1960s. And he argued that there's something rigorous and instructive about the experience of getting stoned and listening to music as if it really mattered. And although millions of people in the 60s listened to rock with the help of psychedelics, this phenomenon has been unexplored. It's just a very good book. It was published by the University of Chicago Press. He's a tenured professor, and it did not get a single review, and it didn't get a review in the Journal of American History or American Historical Review or Reviews in American History. Nick Bromell, Bromell. And then until recently, just incidentally, Noam Chomsky's books were not reviewed in any of these journals. As recently as 2005, at that point he had written 30 books. None of them have been reviewed in any of the major journals. And so all this, I guess what I want to suggest here today, just wrapping up, is that I think it's very useful to approach this book through a bifurcated lens. On the one hand, it's a cultural artifact from a time when historians approached their work with a keen sense of political mission, in an environment that was very hostile, and a great personal sacrifice. And so Jesse and Stoughton and others, emerge as saintly figures and as heroes, I think, from these pages. And then I think this book also, resonates, and it continues to have relevance. He's provided a kind of template or a model that American historians can use today to understand, what's going on in their own professions. Jesse did some of that work himself in his remarks, and I found it, useful to apply his framework or his rubric to my subfield. It was edifying for me, and so I encourage you guys to read this book. And thanks again.